Okay, let's try this again. I seem to be having troubles today. Hopefully I don't have to take two takes of this video in order to get this one right. Seems to be the thing with me. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. Anyway, so this is going to be part 3 of Why I Became Catholics. Parts 1 and 2 can be found on my channel under a playlist called Becoming Catholic, I think is what I called the playlist. I only have one playlist, so it shouldn't be too confusing. And so in parts 1 and 2, I talked about why I left the Protestant Church. In this part, I'm going to be speaking about why I chose to become Catholic, or why I was drawn towards the Catholic Church. So that's going to be the focus of this video. Hopefully I can finish up the video or finish up the series in the next video rather than dragging it out. And again, I want to, since I've already covered why I left the Protestant Church, I will probably not be covering that as much from now on. And if I'm doing things correctly, I probably won't need to cover that again. And I can just focus on why I was drawn towards the Catholic Church. So again, parts 1 and 2, I'm speaking about problems I had with the Protestant Church. Now parts 3 and 4 and onwards, I'm going to be speaking about why I was drawn towards a more traditional style church. So we're not at Catholic yet, but I'm being drawn towards a traditional style church. So what happened with me is I found myself being more and more drawn to tradition, to traditionalism. And I'll explain how that happened and how that applies to being drawn toward the church. Okay, so one of the things I noticed is what could be called either modernism, liberalism, secular humanism. That general sort of idea, I was beginning to really question that entire paradigm, right? So, and this all started probably, like years and years ago, that I was starting to see something within the culture. And what I saw was that the cultural moral values did not match my own values. And so when somebody's faced with that, and I'm not just talking about like a little bit off here and a little bit off there. I'm talking about like a complete difference between my values and the values of the culture I was within. Now, when someone is in that circumstance, they have to do some sort of self-reflection, right? And you have to ask, why are my views different? And am I right in my views, right? You should be doing that if your views go against the culture as a whole. Because it's a painful thing to be living within a culture and then feeling as if you don't really belong. You're an outsider because your views are completely different. Your moral views are increasingly different. And so you have to do some self-reflection. You have to ask yourself, am I right about this? Do I want to continue on in my beliefs? Or should I change them and become more like the culture? And so this started happening to me probably like 10 or more years ago, 10, 11 years ago. And so as I reflected upon this over time, I noticed that not only were my views different, they were becoming increasingly different. Even if I kept my views the same, my views, the culture was going from, let's say here, like let's say my views were here, and the culture was here, the cultural moral value was going like this. And so again, there's going to be a problem there. There's going to be a problem with anyone who's witnessing their culture increasingly sliding away from them in terms of morals. And that's not to say I'm a better person than the culture at large. I'm talking about moral standards, having beliefs, and having an understanding of ethics and morals and where they come from and everything like that, and what's right and what's wrong. Now, whether one lives up to those standards is a different question. And so I'm like, it becomes very demotivating when you're living in a culture like that, as probably many of you know, right? And so I also then started to realize that not only was the culture getting worse and worse and didn't seem to be showing any signs of getting better, I also started to see that this thing had been happening for a long time. That it was not just a recent thing, there was not just a recent turn. And so when I realized that, that naturally begs the question, obviously, where things went wrong. Where did things go wrong, right? And so I had to figure that out. I spoke a little bit about this in video 2, but that was more in reference to, let's say, Protestantism. But what I started to see once I looked at all of that, where have things gone wrong and everything like that, is that my own moral views, because of the culture I lived in, had been corrupted. And not only just like corrupted in a little sense, they were entirely corrupted. It was systematically corrupted. My moral philosophy was systematically corrupted. And again, just to explain this to people who aren't, let's say, into like deeper, high-minded topics, whatever you want to call it, we all have a moral philosophy that we see the world through, right? I don't think there's anyone who doesn't, because we're all moral human beings. We all have a view of what's right and what's wrong, and we have a filter through which we decide what's right and what's wrong. And, we can see this in just the narratives that go on in the culture at large. And through those narratives, you can break those down and look at what people actually think, what people actually believe determines what is right and what is wrong. Okay, so I realized, at having seen this corruption of the culture and having seen that it had been corrupted, number one, for a long time, it was not getting, it was not getting any better. And having looked at all of that, I realized that my own moral philosophy was not, what's the term? I hate this. Sometimes I just forget words off the top of my head. My own moral philosophy was not safe from being corrupted by the culture. And this was the moral philosophy I had pretty much had my entire life. And so once you see that your own moral philosophy has been corrupted by the culture, well, I mean, there's going to be an even larger shift in what goes on, right? There's going to be an even larger shift in moral philosophies. So just to give an example of how my moral philosophy was corrupted, I'll give you this. So obviously, I would have always believed that murder was wrong, right? Within my own personal moral philosophy. Murder is, of course, wrong. Okay. However, there's different ways at arriving at why murder is wrong. There's different ways at arriving at that conclusion. And the way I had arrived at that conclusion, and again, it's not as if you sit down when you're a kid and you go, why is it wrong to kill? You just kind of have that sense. And then maybe, I think afterward, I don't exactly know how this develops within a person, but they start developing a system of why things are wrong rather than just what is wrong and what is right. You start developing a system of how to look at the world and filter, just an absurd amount of different situations and figure out which situations are right, which situations are wrong, what is justice, right? And so, again, murder is wrong, right? We all agree that murder is wrong, but why is it wrong? Well, within what I had believed is, if you were to ask me why is murder wrong, I would be like, oh, well, it's a taking of a human life. It's a human rights violation, right? And if you're at all familiar with the current culture, you would understand what that means, human rights violation, right? And so we're using that to arrive at what's right and what's wrong in some senses, and not all of the senses, but within that kind of thing. I'm like, it's a violation of human rights, blah, 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 and that's why it's wrong. Okay, well, as my views started to shift, I started to realize that, let's say, that wasn't correct. That wasn't the best way at arriving at that conclusion. That isn't to say that it's necessarily 100% wrong. It's a 100% faulty way of arriving at that conclusion. It's just perhaps not the best and most, it's not the best understanding of what makes something moral or immoral, right? So, and I mean, this is actually very important, and I'll explain this. So what I began to realize, not even began to realize at that point, because I don't think I realized this until like just recently, right? Just recently I realized this, but that's because the change in my moral philosophy arrived at this conclusion way later on. And so, again, before I believed taking a human life is wrong because it violates human rights. And now what do I believe? Well, now what I believe is that taking a human life is wrong. Primarily, you could arrive at this conclusion in different ways, but primarily it's wrong because it's a violation of your own authority, right? You're taking authority that you do not have. And maybe I shouldn't even say primarily, but there's a point in there, right? That it's not just wrong because, oh, it's a violation of human rights. It's wrong because you're taking an authority over a person that you just do not have. You do not have that authority over the person. So what does that mean? What does that imply? Well, you see, the issue with saying that it's just a violation of human rights and therefore it's wrong implies that morals are derived from human beings. When I say that it's wrong because, and again, not necessarily the only reason it's wrong, but when I say it's wrong because you're taking a position of authority that you have no right to take, that goes from the focus on man at the center of moral philosophy to God at the center of moral philosophy. It takes then man, who has very little authority, and puts God in the center instead, right? It replaces man with God. And so the modern understanding of like a moral philosophy or whatever, or ethics, is that man is at the center of that. And man is not at the center of that. And this is what I started to realize, right? That's how my views began to shift. That's the way in which I saw that my moral views were corrupted, because man is not at the center of ethics, right? And so, like I said, the implications of this are far-reaching, right? Once you have a shift like that in your views, you can't really help but be the same after that. You're going to have things change. You're going to have your views on a lot of things change because it's very significant. It's not a little thing. Okay, and you know what else this implies? That authority and hierarchy are given by God and they're created by God, right? So authority and hierarchy are given by God, right? So we can't just ignore authority. We can't just ignore hierarchy and think and believe that everyone's equal. That's evil, right? That's not a Christian belief that everyone's equal. That is, I mean, it's just fundamental. It's observably, it's demonstrably not true. And I mean, maybe, I mean, we're all equal in the sense that God loves us all the same, or I'm assuming he loves us all the same. You know, Christ died for all men, so we're all equal in that sense. But I mean, in what other sense are we equal? We're not equal in authority. There's no position, there's no way of saying that that's true. So, I mean, to get rid of hierarchy and say that we're all equal, and again, that's just another way in which my views shifted, okay? So because of my change in morals, because of my change in my understanding of ethics, I saw that the philosophy at the center of the modern world was corrupted. That the philosophy at the center of modernism, our modern understanding of things, was inherently corrupted. Not just corrupted in a little sense, but was just through and through wrong. And so when I realized that, what that did is it killed the modern argument that our pre-modern cultures were generally less virtuous than our culture, right? Because we had been taking as a culture, we had been taking the moral high ground for quite a while. You know, we'd been saying, oh, you know, those people who came before us, they were backwards, they were unenlightened, blah, 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 blah. Well, once you realize that the modern world is corrupt, and not only just a little bit corrupt, but corrupt to its very understanding of ethics itself, it's very difficult to take the moral high ground above your ancestors, right? Because, I mean, if you look back at what your ancestors believed, and you're like, well, I mean, at least they had a better moral philosophy than we do. At least they had a better understanding of ethics than we do. It becomes impossible to take the moral high ground. And that's what has been going on in the culture. And so once you see that, you're like, well, I can't subscribe to this idea. I can no longer subscribe to this idea that I'm more moral and virtuous than my ancestors, right? And so once you do that, well, again, dominoes just start to fall. So what then happens when you start piecing all of that together, you become drawn to tradition, right? It draws you towards tradition because the modern world doesn't answer the modern world doesn't give good answers to dilemmas, right? It gives very corrupt and evil answers to dilemmas. And so then I'm drawn to tradition because there's not much else to go on, right? You're drawn to this tradition. Okay, that's like one sense in which I was drawn to tradition. And now you might be asking, well, what does this have to do with Catholicism and Catholicism? How does that draw you to Catholicism? I'm like, well, because traditional societies were Catholic and or Orthodox, whatever kind of thing you want to look at. But as if you're a Western European, traditional societies are Catholic. And I'm a Western European, I'm Irish, right? And so there's Catholicism right there. And so again, me being a Christian, I'm going to be then, since I'm drawn to tradition, I'm going to then be drawn to a traditional form of Christianity, right? So the interesting thing that I noticed while I was preparing for this is that not only was I drawn to tradition, like because of this shift, this paradigm shift, I was also drawn to tradition, I mean, like 10 years ago, I started to have this understanding. And I mean, like in grade 11, I started listening to classical music. Just decided I wanted to listen to some music that was made on the piano. Now, this is like, and as I was listening to this more and more, I'm like, this music is a higher form of music than the music within our own culture. And I'm like, yeah, it's just better. It's a higher form of music. And classical music, what does that imply? Traditional music. And again, somebody could go back and say, oh yeah, well, the classical era, it was already in the sort of modern world. Okay, I mean, there's probably some truth to that, but I mean, like, people from the classical era of music would be utterly shocked at the state of the world we're in now, at the state of the morals we now have. So yeah. So I view this music, once I started listening to this and other pursuits of knowledge, to be a major factor in my conversion back to Christianity. So actually listening to classical music, this is interesting, listening to classical music was a major factor when I was like 16 or 17 in bringing me back to Christianity, because before that I had been living in a life of sin, of willful sin, knowing that if I was to die at that moment, I was going to go to hell. And so, well, believing that, I hadn't committed a mortal sin as far as I was aware, so, and I had been baptized, so perhaps not, but that's a topic for another time. Okay, so also in regards to this entire being drawn to tradition, I think it was at about the age of 20, I was introduced to the author named G.K. Chesterton. And he quickly became one of my favorite nonfiction authors. So, and I get it. There's like this meme out there that these trad boys are all into G.K. Chesterton and blah, 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 blah. I get that there's this like meme out there about this. And it's like the followings of all great men, all men of genius, are kind of annoying. Like they're, like people who are really into Thomas Aquinas and just can't stop talking about Thomas Aquinas. I mean, yeah, people like that are a little bit annoying, but that doesn't get rid of the fact that Thomas Aquinas was a genius, right? Or had some really good things to say. And it's the same with Chesterton. Just because some of the people who follow him and won't shut up about him doesn't negate the fact that the man was a literary genius. That's almost impossible to deny if you know anything about writing, right? If you know anything about writing and how difficult it is, you know that the man's a genius, right? Okay, so I started reading his stuff at, I think it was about the age of 20. A friend introduced me to his works, wrote a book called Orthodoxy, and I read that. That was the first book of his I read. And I was just like really, again, within his works, there's just this like really traditional message that's just given out again and again and again. For example, one of his more famous quotes is, "Don't ever take a fence down until you know the reason it was put up." Right? So he's like, don't ever take a fence down until you know the reason it was put up. What does that mean? Well, I mean, that's a strong principle of tradition, right? This is saying respect the traditions that were handed down to you and understand the reasons they're there. And so again, I was influenced in my philosophy at I think about the age 20 when I read this sort of thing. I'm trying to remember which book that's from. Oh yeah, in G.K. Chesterton's a Catholic, so again, I'm going to be drawn in that way. My favorite author is Catholic. It's just interesting that I was reading a Catholic author at the age of 20 and going like, wow, this guy really knows what he's talking about. And if people in the modern world read his stuff and actually took it to heart, I mean, we'd probably live in a completely different culture. And that's not to say that, Chesterton alone can save the modern world. I'm just saying that he's supporting a very traditional worldview. So in my formative years, before I make my last point, I'm going to read just a passage from Chesterton so this will actually help me make my last point. So just let me find this here. This is, it's going to be a little bit out of context, but just listen to the words he's saying. They profess to include what is beautiful in all creeds, but they appear to many to have collected all that is dull in them. All the colors mixed together in purity ought to make a perfect white. Mixed together on any human paint box, they make a thing like mud, and a thing very like many new religions. Such a blend is often something much worse than any one creed taken separately, even the creed of the thugs. Okay, so that's just the reason I read that passage is to demonstrate the way in which he wrote, right? And it's not just about Chesterton. I'm like, he's from the late 19th and early 20th century. And when you read something like that, when you read his books, you're like, wow, this guy really knows how to write. And, the sentences are beautiful and everything like that. Now I'm going to read a passage from this book here. It's called Sex is Not the Problem, Lust Is. So it's about sexual purity. And it's written by a Christian author. So just remember the passage I just read and compare it to this passage here. Is this how it's supposed to be? Did Jesus die to win this for us? No, it's not. God doesn't want you to live in an endless cycle of defeat. Chelsea is right. Our Heavenly Father does have so much more planned for us than a life dominated by lust, guilt, and shame. Now, you see, that passage is very digestible. It's very easy to understand. Whereas the passage I read in this book, not so easy to understand. There's metaphors in it, right? And so when you compare those two things and you compare, let's say, even books written from that time period to, let's say, books written now, this isn't to say that all books written now are bad, but I've noticed that there's been a large degradation in the quality of literature, right? And so this is another thing I noticed. Noticed in the formative years of my adulthood was that I had the understanding that the culture that came before us was better than the culture that we have now. And I mean that this is almost undeniable, right? I don't even know how you can deny that music used to be better than it is now. Books used to be better than they are now. Other things, food, everything like that, better than it is now. The understanding, the appreciation. I mean, the arts, right? Just the arts in general. I mean, look at modern art. Like, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that it sucks. Look at modern architecture. It sucks. It's garbage, right? So when you see all of this in the modern world, when you're reading G.K. Chesterton, when you're listening to classical music, you're going to be drawn to a more traditional view of things. Now, when you have that, you're like, oh, the culture was better back then. But you still believe that, oh, we're probably more virtuous. Our view is more virtuous. But then once that gets completely destroyed, you can't remain a modernist. And so once that happens, once you're drawn to tradition and you're a Christian, the natural question then becomes, what do I do with my Christian beliefs in light of tradition? And, well, like I said, there's two traditional Christian churches, the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, right? And so if you become a traditionalist, you're going to be drawn to one of those two if you're a Christian. And I think that's all I have for today. I think I'm going to be running out of time. There was a comment I wanted to get to that actually applied to what I said this week. And it was a comment on my first video. But, I really don't think I have time for it. So I'm going to leave that until next time. God bless you.